Good morning. Welcome to the Long Live Third Parties podcast. Free Press Media Press Inc., a third parties books publisher, sponsors this podcast. I'm Andrew Bouchard. Today I read the case Hagelin for President versus Graves, 25 F3D 956, Court of Appeals, 10th Circuit, 1994. Friends, today we're going down memory lane of the 90s. So let's summon that time period. How many of you out there remember the Natural Law Party? If you do, you rock. If you don't, you can rock too, for other reasons. You rock because you listen to this podcast. The Natural Law Party was a prominent third party back in the day. And this case demonstrates that they were willing to take a stand not only for themselves, but for third parties in general. They challenged the ballot access laws of Kansas. So let's read from the record. It says, quote, plaintiffs Dr. John Hagelin for President Committee of Kansas, Dr. John Hagelin, Jesse Nichols, Patricia Robinson, and Wanda Fern Kelly appealed from a summary judgment in favor of Bill Graves as Secretary of State of Kansas. Plaintiffs Hagelin, Nichols, and Robinson were candidates for national office with the Natural Law Party in 1992. Hagelin for president, Nichols for U.S. Senator, Robinson for U.S. Representative. Plaintiff Kelly is a registered voter in Kansas who wished to vote for the candidates in the November 1992 general election. Each of the candidates missed the deadline set forth in Kansas statute annotated 25.305b for independent candidates to file nominating petitions. This section requires that the filing of nominating petitions by the Monday preceding the primary election, which turns out to be 91 days before the general election. Plaintiffs argue that Kansas's ballot access laws unfairly discriminate against independent candidates by requiring them to submit their nomination petitions 91 days before the general elections, while the Republican and Democratic parties can place their presidential candidates on the ballot at any time after such candidates are designated. They also contend that the state's interests do not justify the burdens imposed by its laws. End quote. So how does that register with you? Do you think this court is going to find their arguments persuasive? If you've looked at the other cases we've discussed on this podcast so far, you may deem that it's going to be a challenge. Third parties talk about the importance of ballot access all the time and how much of a struggle it is. And in reading these cases, I see it up close. We got some obstacles, but I salute the Natural Law Party for challenging something that you may not have a good possibility of winning, at least not right away. So good job, folks. You are setting this in motion, and may one day we get the ballot access we need. In this case, like other cases, they talk about the specifics of Kansas's ballot access rules. They say, quote, candidates who are unable to have their names placed on the ballot through these means may still participate in the election process as write-in candidates. Such candidates must file an affidavit of writing candidacy by the second Monday before the general election. End quote. On a prior podcast, we talked about Oklahoma, and they prohibited write-in candidates. So therefore, this is maybe better because they are allowing it. I'm sorry, it was Hawaii that prohibited write-in votes. But this is better because it allows it. The record also says, quote, the Natural Law Party was formed on April 20th, 1992, which was too late to file for recognized party status under Section 25.302 that year. It began its effort to obtain the necessary nominating petitions for candidates in late 1992. End quote. Think about that. Imagine the founding events of the Natural Law Party in 1992. Would you have liked to be there? I would like to be at the founding events of a third party. I imagine there could be some stress involved. It could be frustration. I read the biography about Eugene Debs and how some of the socialist conventions went, so I could see how it would be similar to this. Overall, it's a good thing, despite the stress, despite the frustration they could have faced. So we salute them for forming their party. Again, they talk about how these ballot access laws violate the First and 14th Amendments. I've seen that pop up. Again, that's an argument our side is using. Do you think it's a good argument? Do you like it? Let me know. The decision says, quote, ballot access restrictions burden two different, though overlapping, rights. The right of individuals to associate to advance their political beliefs, and the right of qualified voters to cast effective votes. These rights rank among our most precious freedoms. A filing deadline that falls unequally on independent candidates impinges by its very nature on associational choices protected by the First Amendment. It discriminates against those candidates, and of particular importance against those voters whose political preferences lie outside the existing political parties. End quote. I love what they're saying here. The rhetoric is beautiful. It talks about the First Amendment and Free Press Media Press Inc. In addition to advancing third parties, we have a mission to advance the First Amendment. So one of my favorite things is when you combine the First Amendment and third parties together. So way to go, Natural Law Party, for doing that. They also concede the following. They say, quote, nor can we say that Section 25.305b deadline falls unequally on independent candidates to the decrement. Plaintiffs argue that Section 25.301 is advantageous to major parties because it imposes no time limits on them to submit their names to the names of their presidential nominees. End quote. What do you think about that argument? Do you find it persuasive? Do you find all arguments our side make persuasive? Or do you think some are not persuasive and we should use more persuasive ones? Let me know. They say here that it is okay what they're doing with the state of Kansas because these smaller parties don't have to deal with the nomination processes of the big parties, the two parties. They acknowledge what the state of Kansas has to go through to approve ballots. And let me know if you think this is valid. It says, quote, the state initially asserts 5 interests: voter education, prevention of fraud, avoidance of voter confusion, prevention of chaos in the party system, and administrative processing. The district court concluded that the state had virtually admitted that only voter education could justify the filing deadline. End quote. So even though the district court ruled as they didn't believe the state, those rules, those reasons were valid. Prevention of chaos in the party system. In the party system. We third parties don't want the party system, so we want chaos. Chaos can be good. Of course, it's good to prevent fraud, so we probably can't argue with that in theory, but in practice, that may not be a valid reason. Voter confusion, that doesn't really strike me as a good reason. They also say, quote, the state has not shown it needs 91 days for administrative processing. The Secretary of State and county election officials are required by statute to determine the validity of a nomination petition or declaration of intent within 10 days after filing, excluding Saturdays, Sundays, and holidays, or within about 14 days. End quote. Do you think that's good, friends? Do you think that's wise? I bet you don't, because you're a fan of the third parties listening to this podcast. So they say 75 days is the amount the state of Kansas should need. Do you think that's the right amount? This is what they state. They say, quote, viewing Kansas's election scheme in its entirety, as we must, see Libertarian Party versus Bond, we conclude it is a reasonable response to the state's interest in voter education. End quote. I imagine a lot of third parties are not going to agree with that. As they continue, it says, quote, it is reasonable for Kansas to require, in furtherance of its interest in educating the electorate, that independents make their candidacies official at approximately the same time the major party candidates are chosen, i.e. on or about the date of the primary. End quote. For those of us who do not like these ballot access laws, let me ask you this. What type of ballot access laws do you propose? What type of deadlines do you propose? It would be interesting to discuss that. We want to get our friends on the ballot as much as possible. So let me know what you think about. Ultimately, they declared the following, quote, we conclude that the state's interests justify the slight burden Section 25.305b imposes on plaintiffs' rights. Consequently, we affirm the judgment of the United States District Court for the District of Kansas. End quote. Alas, we didn't win this one, but we applaud John Hagelin and the Natural Law Party for fighting this fight. May one day we win more and more of these battles. May one day we get what we need. Long live third parties. Goodbye.